The moment my younger brother told the lawyer to skip my name, I knew my life had just split into a before and an after. We were sitting in the walnut-paneled conference room overlooking Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Snow pressed against the tall windows like a silent witness. My hands were folded neatly on the table, nails trimmed, palms calm. I was 62 years old, a retired operations director who had spent 4 decades fixing other people's messes. I believed I understood betrayal. I was wrong. "Let's proceed," my brother Daniel said, not looking at me. "She doesn't need to be included." The word excluded landed like a physical blow. The lawyer, a man named Howard Klein, with wire-rimmed glasses and a voice trained to be neutral, hesitated. "Mrs. Caldwell is listed as—" Daniel raised one finger. "We've already discussed this. The updated will supersedes." I felt heat rise in my chest. My mother had been buried 3 weeks earlier, on a gray November morning just before Thanksgiving. I had stood beside the casket, while Daniel cried theatrically into his wife's shoulder. I had paid for the flowers. I had written the obituary. I had held my granddaughter's hand when she asked where Grandma had gone. And now, in this room, I was being erased. I am Margaret Caldwell. I was born in Milwaukee, raised in a family that believed loyalty mattered more than love, and I built my entire adult life around responsibility. I stayed. I sacrificed. I showed up. And apparently, that was my mistake. Howard cleared his throat and continued reading. The family home, a sprawling brick mansion on Ridgewood Drive, went to Daniel. The controlling shares of Caldwell Industrial Supply, the company my father founded and I helped modernize, went to Daniel. Even my mother's jewelry, pieces I remembered polishing with her at the kitchen table, were assigned to Daniel's daughter. My name did not appear once. I sat there, breathing slowly, listening to my own pulse in my ears. Around the table were people who had known me my entire life. My sister-in-law Karen avoided my eyes. Daniel kept his jaw tight, victorious. No one spoke up. When the reading ended, Daniel finally turned to me. "You understand, Maggie. Mom wanted harmony. You've always been independent." Independent. The word tasted bitter. I looked at him then. Really looked. The brother I had covered for when he stole petty cash at 17. The brother I had bailed out during his second divorce. The brother whose children I watched every Christmas while he and Karen took cruises they couldn't afford. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was manipulation. I stood up slowly, chair legs scraping against the floor. "I understand perfectly," I said. My voice sounded steady, which surprised even me. Daniel exhaled, relieved. He thought it was over. It wasn't. As I walked out into the cold, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Check the dates on the will. Not everything adds up." That was the open loop that would keep me awake for the next 3 nights. That was the crack in the story they were trying to sell me. Revenge, I would later learn, does not begin with anger. It begins with curiosity. And I was just getting started. At home that night, alone in my modest condo, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and pulled out a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were documents I'd kept without realizing why. Old board meeting notes, email printouts, a photocopy of my mother's original will from 12 years earlier, naming both of us equal. Somewhere between those pages was a hidden truth, and I was going to find it. I did not cry the night I realized my family had planned this for years. Instead, I cleaned. I scrubbed my kitchen counters until they gleamed, folded laundry with military precision, lined up old file folders across my dining table like chess pieces. Grief can make you collapse. Betrayal makes you organize. The next morning, I drove to Chicago to meet Laura Bennett, a lawyer I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. She had once worked in compliance at Caldwell Industrial before Daniel quietly pushed her out. At the time, I hadn't understood why she left so suddenly. Now, I suspected I was beginning to understand a lot of things, too late. Laura was 58 now, sharp-eyed, silver streaks in her hair. She listened without interrupting as I told her everything. The will, the exclusion, the message. When I finished, she leaned back and steepled her fingers. "Margaret, your brother didn't just rewrite a will. He rewrote history. She pulled a legal pad toward her. First question. When was the will executed? 6 months before Mom died, I said. After her stroke. Laura's eyebrow lifted slightly. That matters. She explained it carefully, patiently. Undue influence, capacity, timing. Key words I had once enforced in company policy now turned into lifelines. The more she spoke, the more a pattern emerged. Daniel had moved my mother into his house after the stroke. Limited visitors, controlled information. He had positioned himself as the gatekeeper of her world, a toxic family dynamic disguised as caregiving. But there's more, Laura said. She slid a folder across the table. I kept copies of something I was never supposed to see. Inside were internal emails from Caldwell Industrial, dated 4 years earlier. Daniel had authorized a series of off-books loans to a shell company registered under Karen's maiden name. The amounts were significant, enough to destabilize the company if exposed. I felt my stomach drop. Why didn't this come out before? Laura's smile was thin. Because your signature covered it. I stared at her. What? Your name was attached as operational approval. Digitally forged. You were the perfect shield. Reliable. Invisible. Excluded. The word? Again. I thought of all the nights I stayed late at the office, while Daniel attended fundraisers and weddings. All the board meetings, where I spoke last so he could speak loudest. I had built the scaffolding of his success, and he had used it to hang me. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was professional, financial, systemic. By the time I left Laura's office, the snow had started falling again. Chicago looked washed, clean, innocent. I felt anything but. That evening, Daniel called me, for the first time since the will reading. We're hosting Thanksgiving at the house this year, he said casually. Thought you might want to come. For the kids. I imagined the long dining table, my mother's china, my empty seat filled by someone else's assumptions. Yes, I said after a pause. I'll be there. He sounded surprised, pleased. Good. Let's keep things civil. Civil. Another word people use when they think you're defeated. I hung up and opened my laptop. I began cross-referencing dates, bank filings, board minutes, every piece of paper that told the story they assumed I'd never read closely. The mini-hook came when I noticed a discrepancy. One signature date on the will overlapped with a hospital record. My mother had been sedated that day. She could not have signed anything. That was when the tension shifted into escalation. This was no longer about being excluded. This was about reclaiming truth. And Thanksgiving was only 3 weeks away. Thanksgiving has a way of sharpening lies. The Caldwell house on Ridgewood Drive looked exactly as it always had. Red brick, white columns, a wreath too large for the door, like everything Daniel did when he wanted to prove something. I parked my car at the far end of the driveway, not because there was no space closer, but because distance helps you observe. Inside, the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon hit me all at once. Voices overlapped, laughter rose and fell. For a moment, it felt almost normal, and that was the most dangerous part. Daniel greeted me with a tight hug. Glad you came, he said, loud enough for others to hear. Performance. Karen smiled beside him, her hand resting possessively on his arm. At the table, place cards had been arranged carefully. My name sat between a teenage cousin and the bathroom door. Excluded without explanation. A familiar ache bloomed in my chest, but it did not consume me the way it once would have. Dinner unfolded with polite conversation and carefully avoided topics. Halfway through the meal, Daniel stood to make a toast. To family, he said, glass raised. To unity. To honoring Mom's wishes. I felt every eye flicker toward me. I raised my own glass slowly. To truth, I said quietly. A few people laughed, unsure if I was joking. Daniel's jaw tightened. Later, while the others moved to the living room, I slipped into my mother's old study. The room smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Her desk sat exactly as she'd left it. Daniel hadn't touched it. He never saw value in sentiment. I opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a thin folder labeled Medical Records. My heart pounded as I flipped through the pages. Hospital notes, medication logs, and there it was. A sedation entry, dated the same day as the will execution. The hidden truth sat in my hands, undeniable. Karen appeared in the doorway. "You shouldn't be in here," she said. "This was my mother's room," I replied. "I think I belong." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Let it go, Margaret. You don't want to do this." "I didn't want any of this," I said, meeting her eyes. "But here we are." Her face hardened. "Daniel did what he had to do." "So did I said. I left the house shortly after, my appetite gone, but my resolve solidified. In my car, I called Laura. "I have proof," I said. "Medical proof." There was a pause on the line, then a sharp inhale. "Then we move," she said, quietly. The next morning, legal notices were filed. A formal challenge to the will, a request for forensic review of company finances, subpoenas drafted, but not yet served. Daniel had no idea. The cliffhanger came that evening, when my phone buzzed with a message from him. "Why are there lawyers calling the company?" I smiled into the dark. "Because you forgot one thing," I typed back. "I was there when everything was built." The first cease and desist letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Daniel's signature sat at the bottom, bold and confident, accusing me of harassment, defamation, and intentional disruption of business operations. Reading it felt surreal, like watching someone set fire to a house while standing inside it. I forwarded it to Laura without comment. Her response came quickly. "Good, he's panicking." That same afternoon, I was summoned to Caldwell Industrial for an emergency board meeting. The long conference table gleamed under fluorescent lights. Faces I had known for years avoided my gaze. Daniel sat at the head, already speaking when I entered. "We're dealing with a hostile situation," he said. "Internal sabotage." I took my seat calmly. "Then it's good I'm here," I said. "Transparency helps." The room went quiet. Daniel clicked a remote and projected a slide onto the screen. "Margaret has filed a baseless challenge to our mother's will and requested financial audits that threaten company stability." I raised my hand slightly. "Correction, I requested verification." He ignored me and continued. "For the sake of the company, I propose we suspend her access to internal systems pending review." There it was. The escalation. I stood. "For years," I said, "this company relied on my silence, my labor, my signatures. Now that I'm asking questions, you call it sabotage." One board member shifted uncomfortably. Another cleared his throat. I slid a copy of the hospital record across the table. "This is the day Mom supposedly signed the new will," I said. "She was sedated, incapacitated." Daniel's face drained of color. "And these," I continued, placing another folder down, "are loan transfers approved under my name while I was out of state. Forged." The room erupted in murmurs. Daniel stood abruptly. "This meeting is adjourned." "No," said the board chair, a man named Richard Hale. "It isn't." For the first time in years, Daniel was not in control of the room. By the end of the meeting, a forensic audit had been approved. My access was restored. Daniel was instructed not to interfere. As I left the building, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Karen. "You're destroying your own family. Is this revenge worth it?" I stopped walking. The cold air bit into my lungs. I typed back slowly. "This isn't revenge. It's accountability." Her reply came seconds later. "You'll regret this." I looked up at the gray sky, the company logo etched into the building behind me. For the first time, I felt no fear, only certainty. Because regret belongs to people who stay silent. And I was done being one of them. The audit cracked open doors Daniel had spent years quietly locking. Once the forensic team stepped into Caldwell Industrial, the building felt different. Conversations stopped when I walked past. Emails went unanswered. Fear has a sound, and it's the sudden absence of noise where there used to be routine. I stayed late most nights. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to witness the unraveling in real time. I watched auditors sift through transaction histories, trace wire transfers, compare handwriting samples. Each discovery landed softly at first, then heavier. Laura called me one evening while I was still in my office. "They found the shell company," she said, registered in Delaware under Karen's maiden name. Daniel used it to funnel funds back into personal accounts. I closed my eyes. Infidelity came to mind. Not romantic, but financial. The kind that corrodes trust just as thoroughly. That's not all, Laura added. He leveraged company credit to cover personal debt. If this goes public, it's not just civil. I hung up and sat still for a long time, listening to the hum of the lights overhead. This had crossed a line long ago. I had simply been too loyal to see it. At home that night, I found a voicemail from my niece, Emily. She was 19, Daniel's daughter, and her voice trembled. "Aunt Maggie," she said, "Dad says you're trying to ruin us. Is that true?" I stared at the wall, my chest tightening. The manipulation was spreading outward now, contaminating the next generation. I called her back immediately. "No," I said gently. "I'm trying to stop a lie from becoming your inheritance." There was a pause. "He says Grandma wanted this." "Your grandmother wanted fairness," I replied. "She trusted the wrong person at the end." Emily didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was small. "I believe you." That almost broke me. The next escalation arrived disguised as reconciliation. Daniel asked to meet for coffee. "Neutral ground," he said. "Just the two of us. No lawyers." I agreed. We sat across from each other in a quiet cafe near the river. He looked tired, older. His confidence had thinned. "You've made your point," he said. "We can settle this privately." "Privately for whom?" I asked. "For the family," he replied. "For the company." "For you," I corrected. He sighed. "What do you want?" I took a breath. The original will reinstated. Equal ownership restored. Public disclosure of the audit findings. His jaw clenched. "That would destroy me." I leaned forward. "You destroyed this the moment you decided I was expendable." He stared at his coffee. "If you go forward, there will be consequences." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm going forward." He left without finishing his drink. 2 days later, the auditors delivered their interim report to the board. The numbers were worse than expected. By the end of the week, Daniel was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The board chair called me personally. "We should have listened to you sooner," he said. I said nothing. That night, Karen showed up at my condo unannounced. Her eyes were red, her posture rigid. "You've humiliated us," she said. "You humiliated yourselves," I replied. She took a step closer. "If Daniel goes down, I'll make sure you do too." I met her gaze steadily. "I've already survived the worst thing you could do to me." She left without another word. As I locked the door behind her, my phone buzzed. A message from Laura. "The district attorney wants to talk." The tension inside me sharpened into something cold and precise. This was no longer a family dispute. This was accountability, moving at full speed. The district attorney's office smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. I sat across from a woman named Angela Ruiz, her expression focused, her pen moving steadily as I spoke. She asked clear questions. She listened carefully. She did not soften the facts for comfort. When I finished, she closed her folder. "This is bigger than inheritance manipulation," she said. "This is fraud. Potential criminal exposure." I nodded. "I understand. Are you prepared for what that means?" she asked. I thought of Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas mornings, years of swallowing discomfort for the sake of peace. "Yes," I said. "I am." The investigation moved faster after that. Subpoenas were issued. Accounts frozen. Caldwell Industrial's lenders requested meetings. Rumors spread beyond the family, beyond the company. The press caught the scent and circled. Daniel called me repeatedly. I did not answer. Karen sent emails, alternating between threats and pleas. I forwarded them to Laura. Emily stopped speaking to her parents. She started calling me instead. One afternoon, while reviewing documents with Laura, she slid a folded piece of paper toward me. "There's something else," she said. It was a handwritten letter, my mother's handwriting, dated 2 months before her stroke. "Margaret, if you are reading this, then something has gone wrong. Please know I never intended to choose one child over another. I trusted Daniel to do right by both of you. If he didn't, I am sorry." Tears blurred the words. "This letter was never filed," Laura said quietly. Daniel kept it. The emotional wound reopened, sharper now, because it came with clarity. My mother had not betrayed me. She had been used. At the next board meeting, the chair announced Daniel's removal, pending criminal review. His authority revoked, his access terminated. No one argued. As the meeting adjourned, A man I had worked beside for 20 years stopped me in the hallway. "You saved this company," he said. I shook my head. I stopped it from bleeding out. That evening, I attended a small Christmas gathering at my daughter's apartment. Nothing formal, no seating charts, just food and warmth. At one point, she pulled me aside. "I didn't know how much you carried," she said. "I'm sorry." I hugged her tightly. "You know now. That's enough." Later, as I walked home through softly falling snow, my phone buzzed one last time. A message from Daniel. "You think you've won. You have no idea what's coming." I stopped under a streetlight and typed my reply carefully. "I already survived what you did. Anything else is just noise." I put the phone away and kept walking, because the climax was approaching. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. The trial date arrived faster than I expected, as if the truth itself had grown impatient. By early spring, Caldwell Industrial was no longer whispering. It was bracing. Vendors demanded reassurance. Employees watched the elevators like weather vanes, gauging which direction the wind would blow next. I returned to the office not as a savior, but as a stabilizing presence. That distinction mattered to me. Daniel had been formally charged. Fraud, forgery, financial manipulation. The words looked unreal printed on letterhead, but they grounded everything that followed. Karen retained her own counsel and moved out of the Ridgewood mansion, quietly, the way people do when they realize the ground beneath them has cracked. I thought I would feel vindicated. Instead, I felt tired. The emotional wound shifted shape in those weeks. Anger faded into something heavier, more reflective. I had spent decades being responsible for outcomes that were never truly mine. Now that accountability had finally arrived, I had to decide who I would be without that burden. One afternoon, Emily asked if she could move in with me temporarily. "I don't feel safe at home," she said. "Not physically, but emotionally." I understood that language too well. She brought one suitcase. We cleared space in my guest room. She cried the first night, quietly, embarrassed by the sound of it. I sat beside her and listened. No advice, just presence. That was the first time I felt the release begin. At work, the board voted to reinstate my full authority pending final resolution. I declined the title of interim chief executive and instead proposed a transition committee. I wanted sustainability, not control. Power taken back is different from power clung to. The mini hook came in an envelope marked confidential, slipped under my office door late one evening. Inside was a copy of an email chain I had never seen. Daniel had attempted to sell a controlling interest in the company months before our mother's death. Quietly. To an outside investor. The deal fell through only because my signature was required. I felt my hands shake as I read. He hadn't just excluded me. He had tried to erase me completely. Laura confirmed it the next morning. "If that sale had gone through," she said, "you would have been locked out permanently." I closed my eyes. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. This was about survival. The trial opened on a Monday. Daniel looked smaller at the defense table, his confidence replaced by something brittle. He did not look at me when I took my seat. Karen stared straight ahead, jaw tight, as if sheer will could undo facts. The prosecution laid out the timeline with surgical precision. The forged signatures, the shell accounts, the manipulated will, the attempted sale. When my turn came to testify, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I spoke about systems, about trust, about how favoritism poisons families the same way it poisons companies. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I told the truth. When I stepped down, the courtroom felt heavier, as if something irreversible had been placed on record. That night, alone at home, I poured a glass of wine and sat at my dining table, the same place where months earlier I had organized my grief into folders. The tension had peaked. The climax was coming. And no matter the verdict, I knew something fundamental had already shifted. I had stopped protecting someone else's version of the story. The verdict did not come with drama. No gasps, no shouting. Just the judge's voice, steady and measured, delivering consequences that could not be undone. Daniel was found guilty on multiple counts. The words settled into the room like dust after a collapse. Karen's face crumpled briefly before she masked it. Emily squeezed my hand so tightly I could feel her pulse. I did not look at my brother. I did not need to. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Microphones stretched forward. Questions flew. Do you feel justice was served? Is this about revenge? Will the family ever recover? I stopped and turned. This was never about revenge, I said. It was about truth. And truth doesn't destroy families. Lies do. Then I walked away. The release came slowly over the next few weeks. Accounts were settled. The original will was reinstated. Assets redistributed according to my mother's actual wishes. The company entered a recovery phase, cautious but intact. I took a leave of absence, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I needed space to understand who I was without constant vigilance. Emily returned to school. My daughter invited me to dinner without asking me to bring anything. I noticed how different that felt, being wanted without being useful. One afternoon, I visited my mother's grave alone. I wish I had asked more questions sooner, I said aloud. But I won't punish myself for surviving the way I knew how. The wind moved through the trees gently, not in answer, but in acknowledgement. That evening, Laura called. There's nothing left pending, she said. Legally, you're clear. I thanked her and hung up. Later, I opened my laptop and began writing. Not legal notes, not strategy, just reflections. About women who carry families quietly. About how being excluded teaches you to observe. About how karma isn't sudden, it's cumulative. I realized then that revenge had never been my destination. Reclamation was. The tables had turned, not because my brother fell, but because I stood. And for the first time in my life, the future did not feel like something I had to manage. It felt like something I could choose. The rebirth had begun. And it was quieter, stronger, and more enduring than anything I had imagined. I did not expect forgiveness to be harder than anger. The weeks after the verdict blurred together in a strange quiet. The noise that had filled my days for months vanished, leaving behind long mornings and unstructured afternoons. For the first time since my 20s, no one needed me to fix anything. At first, the silence felt like relief. Then, it felt like exposure. I returned to Caldwell Industrial only once a week, not to oversee, but to observe. The transition committee was doing its work. New leadership emerged naturally. People I trusted, but had never empowered because I had been too busy buffering Daniel from consequences. Watching them lead felt like watching a child ride a bike without training wheels. Uneasy. Proud. One afternoon, as I was leaving the building, a woman I barely knew stopped me near the elevators. Her name was Susan. She worked in accounts payable. I just wanted to say thank you, she said, for standing up. Some of us thought we were invisible. The word landed softly, but stayed with me all the way home. Invisible had been my role for so long that I had mistaken it for safety. That evening, Emily came home unusually quiet. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, pushing her food around with her fork. He wrote me, she said finally. I knew who she meant. What did he say? I asked. She swallowed. That he's sorry. That he did everything for us. That you turned everyone against him. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not anger this time, but grief. You don't have to answer, I said. I know, she replied. But part of me wants to. That part is human, I said gently. Just don't let it rewrite reality. She nodded slowly. I see him clearly now. That's the worst part. I reached across the table and took her hand. Seeing clearly is painful, but it's also freeing. She squeezed back, understanding more than her age should have required. The mini hook arrived a few days later, in the form of a letter forwarded by Laura. Daniel had filed an appeal, not on the criminal charges, on the will. The audacity of it made me laugh out loud, a short, sharp sound that surprised me. Laura's note was brief. It won't succeed. But he's trying to delay the inevitable. Delay had always been Daniel's strategy. Buy time, exhaust others, count on their desire for peace. This time, there was no peace to bargain with. At the appeal hearing, I listened quietly as his attorney argued technicalities. Minor procedural issues, hypothetical misunderstandings. Nothing substantial. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and addressed the judge directly. I did not come here to punish my brother, I said. I came here because the truth was manipulated, and silence would have made me complicit. The judge nodded once. Appeal denied, he said. Just like that, the last thread snapped. Outside the courtroom, Daniel finally looked at me. His eyes were hollow, stripped of calculation. You could have stopped this, he said. I met his gaze steadily. So could you. He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to say. That night, alone in my apartment, I opened the old box again. This time, I removed what no longer belonged to the present. I kept only what felt honest. I slept deeply for the first time in months. The next morning, I booked a ticket. Not away from anything, towards something new. The ocean at Cape Ann looked different when no one expected anything from me. I rented a small cottage overlooking the water, the kind with uneven floors and too many windows. Mornings began with coffee on the porch, the sound of waves steady and indifferent. It reminded me that the world does not pause for our dramas, and yet everything had changed. I walked the shoreline slowly, feeling the pull of memory. I thought about the woman I had been at 55. Competent, reliable, exhausted. I had mistaken endurance for purpose. One afternoon, I received an email from the board. They wanted me back. Not as an operator, but as chair emeritus. Advisory. Optional. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Thank you. I will consider it. That was a new sentence for me. I will consider it. Emily visited one weekend, bringing books and laughter and stories about classes I barely understood. We cooked together. We talked about boundaries, about choosing differently. You don't seem angry anymore, she observed. I'm not, I said. I'm aware, she smiled. That's scarier. Only to people who benefited from my silence, I replied. The infidelity of trust lingered in my thoughts. How betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, procedural, disguised as care. That kind leaves deeper marks. A few days later, Laura called with news I hadn't anticipated. Karen filed for divorce, she said, and Daniel's assets are being liquidated to cover restitution. I closed my eyes and let the information pass through me. No satisfaction, no triumph, just consequence. That evening, I wrote again. Not for anyone else, for myself. About inheritance not as money, but as patterns. About how toxic family structures teach women to shrink so others can feel tall. The rebirth was subtle. It showed up in how I said no without apology, in how I accepted invitations without guilt, in how I stopped explaining myself to people who had never listened. On my last morning by the ocean, I stood barefoot in the sand and let the cold water wash over my feet. I thought of my mother, of the letter she never meant me to find, of the trust she misplaced, and the strength she passed down anyway. I see it now, I whispered. All of it. As I turned back toward the cottage, my phone buzzed. A message from a woman I didn't know. I heard your story. It helped me leave. I stared at the screen. Breath caught in my throat. Revenge had never been my legacy. Truth was. And it was moving outward in ways I could never have planned. The final chapters were no longer about confrontation. They were about choosing how to live with what remains. I returned home in early autumn, when the trees were just beginning to change and everything felt suspended between what had been and what was coming next. Caldwell Industrial no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a workplace again. People laughed in the hallways, meetings ended on time. Decisions were documented instead of whispered. The absence of fear was the most noticeable change. I accepted the role of chair emeritus with conditions. No daily operations, no crisis management, no being the quiet fixer behind the scenes. My job now was guidance, not sacrifice. The board agreed without hesitation. That alone told me how much the power had truly shifted. One afternoon, as I was packing up files in my old office, Richard Hale stood in the doorway. You know, he said, this company nearly lost its soul. I smiled faintly. It did lose it. We just found it again. He nodded. Because you stopped absorbing damage that wasn't yours. That sentence stayed with me. Outside of work, my life felt unfamiliar in the best way. My calendar had space. My phone rang less, but when it did, it was people who wanted me, not what I could provide. My daughter invited me to help plan her anniversary party, not because she needed logistics, but because she wanted my opinion. That distinction mattered more than she knew. Emily came by often. She had grown steadier, more confident. One evening, while we washed dishes together, she said, "Dad wrote again." I didn't stop scrubbing. "How did that feel?" "Different," she said after a moment. "Like reading something from a stranger." I turned to her. "That's not indifference. That's clarity." She nodded. "I don't hate him. I just don't trust him." "That's wisdom," I said, "not cruelty." The mini hook came unexpectedly in a thick envelope delivered by courier. Inside was a formal settlement agreement. Daniel had signed. Full acknowledgement, no contest, no further claims. At the bottom, a handwritten note. "You were always stronger than I admitted." I was afraid of that. I folded the paper carefully and placed it in the drawer with my mother's letter. Not as forgiveness, but as closure. That night, I hosted a small dinner. Nothing elaborate. A few friends, good food, real conversation. At one point, someone asked how I found the courage to stand up after so many years. I considered the question carefully. "I didn't," I said. "I found exhaustion, and I listened to it." Laughter rippled around the table, but the truth beneath it was solid. Exhaustion is honest. It tells you when something is unsustainable. I had ignored it for decades. When I finally stopped, everything else followed. As the evening wound down and guests filtered out, I stood alone in my living room, surrounded by the quiet evidence of a life reclaimed. The tension was gone. What remained was intention. And for the first time, I trusted myself to choose well. I no longer measure my life by what I endure. That realization came quietly, on an ordinary morning. I was standing in my kitchen, sunlight slanting across the counter, when it occurred to me that I was not bracing for anything. No phone call, no emergency, no invisible demand waiting to surface. Just peace. I am 62 years old. I have buried my parents, outlived one version of myself, and watched an entire power structure collapse because it depended on my silence to stand. That is not a tragedy. That is a transformation. The company thrives now under leadership that understands accountability is not optional. I attend quarterly meetings, offer perspective, then leave. I walk out into daylight instead of staying late. I no longer confuse usefulness with worth. Emily graduated in the spring. She hugged me afterward and whispered, "You changed the trajectory of my life." I shook my head gently. "You did. I just refused to lie." My daughter tells me I smile differently now. Softer, less guarded. She's right. I still think about my mother, about the choices she made, and the trust she placed. I no longer judge her for it. We all do the best we can with the information we have at the time. What matters is what we do when the truth arrives. Revenge, people think, is about punishment, about watching someone else fall. But real revenge is quieter. It's refusing to carry shame that was never yours. It's stepping out of toxic family patterns, even when it costs you comfort. It's turning manipulation into accountability and betrayal into clarity. It's choosing yourself without apology. Sometimes I receive messages from women I've never met. They tell me my story helped them question a will, confront favoritism, walk away from a workplace betrayal, or finally say no at a family dinner. Those messages mean more to me than any title or inheritance ever could. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own life, I want you to know something. It is not too late. Not too late to ask questions. Not too late to demand truth. Not too late to stop being excluded from your own story. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like this video. Share your thoughts or experiences in the comments. And if you want more stories about justice, karma, and women reclaiming their power later in life, subscribe to the channel. Your voice matters, and so does your truth. This is not the end. It is the beginning.